Far to the north, beyond the Great Wall of China, lies a land of extremes. It is a place of endless blue skies and rolling grasslands known as the steppe. The winters are brutally cold, the summers scorching hot, and the wind never seems to stop blowing across the open plains. It was here, near the banks of the Annan River in the year 1162, that a boy was born into a world of violence and tribal warfare. He was given the name Temujin. Legend says that when he came into the world, he was clutching a blood clot in his tiny fist, a sign from the heavens that he was destined to be a great warrior who would one day conquer the world. Temujin was the son of a minor chieftain named Yasuge, but his noble birth did not guarantee an easy life. When Temujin was just 9 years old, his father took him to find a future bride from a neighboring tribe. On the journey back, Yasuge shared a meal with a group of Tatars, a rival tribe. The Tatars recognized him and secretly poisoned his food. Yasuge died shortly after, leaving his 2 widows and 7 children alone and vulnerable. In the harsh politics of the steppe, a chieftain needs strength to lead. The tribe saw no value in following a young boy and his mother. They decided to abandon the family. They took the herds of sheep and horses, which were the source of food and survival, and left Temujin and his family behind to die on the frozen plains. This was the moment Temujin lost everything. He went from being the son of a leader to an outcast, forced to survive on wild onions, roots, and rodents. During these desperate years, Temujin learned the most important lessons of his life. He learned that trust was rare and that unity was the only way to survive. He formed a blood brother bond with a young noble named Jamuka. They swore eternal loyalty to one another, a bond that would shape the future of the Mongol people. But even within his own family, tensions ran high. In a dispute over a small fish, Temujin and his brother Kasar killed their older half-brother Bektar. It was a cold, calculated act that established Temujin as the ruthless head of his household. As he grew into a man, Temujin began to rebuild his life. He married Borte, the girl his father had betrothed him to years earlier. But the peace did not last. The Merkid tribe, seeking revenge for an old grievance against Temujin's father, attacked their camp. Temujin escaped on horseback, but Borte was captured and taken away. This kidnapping was a turning point. In the past, a man might have accepted the loss and moved on, but Temujin was different. He went to his blood brother Jamuka and his father's old ally, Togrul, for help. Together, they raised an army and launched a daring raid to rescue Borte. The mission was a success. They defeated the Merkids and retrieved Borte, proving that Temujin was a leader who could command men and win battles. News of his victory spread across the steppe. Warriors who were tired of the constant tribal infighting began to flock to his banner. They saw in him a leader who valued merit and loyalty over bloodlines. Unlike other Khans who gave command positions only to aristocrats, Temujin promoted men based on their ability and bravery. A shepherd could become a general if he showed skill on the battlefield. This revolutionary idea created an army that was fiercely loyal and incredibly disciplined. However, his rising power caused a rift with his blood brother, Jamuka. Jamuka believed in the old ways of aristocracy and saw Temujin as a threat. The 2 friends became bitter enemies. They fought for years, tearing the steppe apart in a civil war. It was a brutal conflict, but Temujin eventually emerged victorious. Jamuka was captured, and, according to the secret history, he asked for a noble death without the spilling of blood. Temujin granted this final wish. By the year 1206, Temujin had defeated all rival tribes. He stood as the sole ruler of the steppe. At a great gathering called a Kurultai, the shaman declared him Genghis Khan, a title that is often translated as the universal ruler or oceanic ruler. The scattered tribes of the Mongols were now one nation under one man. Genghis Khan knew that to keep this volatile nation united, he needed an external target. He turned his eyes south toward the Jin dynasty of northern China. The Jin were wealthy and powerful, protected by massive walls and vast armies. The Mongols, however, had speed and adaptability. They rode hardy ponies and could shoot arrows with deadly accuracy while galloping at full speed. When they encountered the walled cities of China, they learned siege engineering from captured Chinese engineers. They built catapults and used gunpowder, turning the technology of their enemies against them. The campaign against the Jin was long and bloody, but the Mongols were relentless. They sacked the capital city of Zhengdu, present-day Beijing, securing immense wealth and resources. But Genghis Khan did not just want gold, he wanted trade and stability. He reopened the Silk Road, creating a secure environment where merchants could travel from Europe to Asia under the protection of Mongol laws. While his armies were fighting in China, Genghis Khan sought peaceful trade relations with the Khwarezmian Empire to the west, in modern-day Persia and Central Asia. He sent a caravan of merchants and ambassadors to the city of Otrar to establish a trade agreement. The governor of Otrar, suspecting the merchants were spies, had them arrested and killed. Genghis Khan was furious, but he gave the Sultan of Khwarezmia one last chance. He sent 3 ambassadors to demand the governor be handed over for punishment. The Sultan made a fatal mistake. He killed one ambassador and burned the beards of the other 2, sending them back in shame. In Mongol culture, the person of an ambassador is sacred. This act of disrespect unleashed a fury the world had never seen. Genghis Khan gathered his main army and marched west. What followed was not a war of conquest, but a war of annihilation. The Mongols swept through the Khwarezmian Empire like a natural disaster. They used terror as a weapon. If a city surrendered, the people were often spared and taxed. If a city resisted, the entire population was put to the sword, and the skulls of the dead were piled into pyramids as a warning to others. The great cities of Bukhara and Samarkand fell. The Sultan fled to an island in the Caspian Sea, where he died in poverty, while his empire was turned to ash. It is during these campaigns that many rumors about Genghis Khan began to spread. Some said he could control the weather with magic stones. Others whispered that he was a punishment sent by God. While the facts show he was a brilliant military strategist who used spies and psychological warfare, the legends painted him as a supernatural force. He was known for his tolerance of different religions. He allowed Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, and Taoists to practice freely in his empire, believing that the prayers of all faiths could only help him. Despite his fearsome reputation, Genghis Khan was a man who valued order. He created a legal code known as the Yasa. It forbade the kidnapping of women, the theft of animals, and declared that all children were legitimate, regardless of their mother. He created a postal system with relay stations that allowed messages to travel across the empire at incredible speeds. In his final years, Genghis Khan turned his attention back to a rebellion in the Shisha kingdom. During this campaign in 1227, the great conqueror fell ill. Some accounts say he was thrown from his horse during a hunt and sustained internal injuries. Others suggest he died of illness or a wound from an arrow. As he lay dying, Genghis Khan gave strict instructions for his burial. He wanted to return to the earth as he had come, in secrecy. His body was carried back to the Mongol heartland. Legend says that the funeral procession killed anyone they passed on the road to keep the location of the grave a secret. He was buried near the sacred mountain of Burkhan Khaldun, a place he had worshipped as a young man. To ensure the grave would never be disturbed, soldiers rode 1,000 horses over the ground to flatten it, and a river was diverted to flow over the site. To this day, the final resting place of Genghis Khan remains undiscovered. He left behind an empire that was the largest contiguous land empire in history, stretching from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe. He had risen from an abandoned boy on the frozen steppe to the ruler of half the known world. His legacy is one of both creation and destruction, a man who unified the East and West through iron and blood, forever changing the course of human history. With the title of Genghis Khan bestowed upon him in the year 1206, the man formerly known as Temujin faced a challenge even greater than conquering the steppe, which was ruling it. The tribes he had united were accustomed to centuries of feuding and stealing from one another, and he knew that without a new system of order, the fragile alliance would crumble back into chaos. He began to dismantle the old tribal hierarchies that had defined life on the plains for generations. He abolished the traditional clan divisions and reorganized the entire society into a military structure based on the decimal system. Men were assigned to groups of 10 known as an arban. 10 arbans formed a zun, or a company of 100. 10 zuns formed a mingan, a regiment of 1,000. And 10 mingans formed a tumen, a massive division of 10,000 warriors. This system broke the old loyalties to tribal chieftains and replaced them with loyalty to the unit and to the Khan himself. If one man in an arban deserted in battle, the other 9 were executed. If the whole group fled, the entire group of 10 was punished. This created a brotherhood of survival, where every man watched the back of the man next to him, forging a discipline that was unknown in the medieval world. To secure his own safety and project his power, Genghis Khan created an elite bodyguard known as the Keshik. These were not just soldiers, but the sons of generals and high-ranking commanders, serving as hostages to ensure their father's loyalty, while being trained as the future administrators of the empire. The Keshik grew to 10,000 men, who watched over the Khan day and night, split into day guards and night guards, creating an inner circle of absolute trust that was exempt from the laws that governed ordinary men. He also implemented the Great Yasa, a code of law that was spoken rather than written in the early days. It codified the rules of the steppe, making the theft of a horse a capital offense, and enforcing strict regulations on hunting to ensure food stocks were preserved for the winter. The Yasa mandated religious tolerance, exempting priests and holy men of all faiths from taxation, a strategic move that prevented religious uprisings and kept the spiritual leaders of conquered subjects compliant. While he organized his people, a spiritual threat arose from within his own camp. The powerful shaman Kokochu, also known as Teb Tengri, had proclaimed Temujin's destiny as ruler of the world, but now the shaman sought to place himself above the Khan. He began to sow discord among the Khan's brothers, predicting ruin and spreading rumors to consolidate his own influence. Genghis Khan realized that there could not be two suns in the sky. In a move that demonstrated his absolute refusal to share power, he allowed his youngest brother Temujin to confront the shaman. During a wrestling match, which was a common way to settle disputes, the shaman's back was broken. With the spiritual rival removed, Genghis Khan established himself as the sole conduit between the blue sky and the Mongol people. With his internal power secure, the Khan looked outward to the wealthy, sedentary civilizations that had long looked down upon the nomads as barbarians. His first target was the Western Xia, also known as the Tangut Kingdom, a state located to the south of the Gobi Desert. This campaign was a testing ground for his new army. The Mongols were masters of open-field battles, but they had never breached the high walls of fortified cities. When they reached the Tangut capital, they found themselves unable to break through the stone fortifications. Genghis Khan attempted a desperate engineering feat by diverting a nearby river to flood the city. The plan partially backfired when the dike broke and flooded his own camp, but the threat was enough to force the Tangut ruler to surrender and pledge allegiance to the Mongols. This victory provided the Mongols with tribute, camels, and falcons, but more importantly, it opened the path to the true prize, which was the golden khanate of the Jin dynasty. The Jin dynasty controlled northern China and was a superpower of the era, commanding hundreds of thousands of infantry and possessing vast wealth. For years, the Jin had demanded tribute from the Mongol tribes, keeping them weak and divided. When a new Jin emperor ascended the throne and sent an envoy to demand submission from Genghis Khan, the Mongol leader did not kneel. Instead, he turned towards the south and spat on the ground, an ultimate insult, and rode away. It was a declaration of war. In 1211, the year of the sheep, Genghis Khan summoned his warriors to the banks of the Karulin River. They numbered perhaps 100,000, a small force compared to the Jin armies, but they were mobile and hungry for conquest. Before they marched, the Khan climbed the sacred mountain and prayed to the eternal blue sky for 3 days, removing his hat and belt in a sign of humility, asking for vengeance for the wrongs committed against his ancestors. The invasion of the Jin was a clash of two worlds. The Jin relied on static defenses and the Great Wall, but the Mongols simply rode around the fortifications or bribed the gatekeepers. The defining moment came at the Battle of Yehuling, known as the Battle of Badgermouth. The Jin had assembled a massive army in a narrow mountain pass, hoping to crush the Mongols with superior numbers. However, the terrain prevented the Jin from deploying their full force, creating a bottleneck. Genghis Khan sent his general Mukhali to charge the center, while he flanked through the mountains. The Mongols used their famous feigned retreat tactic, pretending to flee in panic. The Jin soldiers broke their ranks to chase them, thinking the victory was won. Suddenly, the Mongols wheeled their horses around, raining armor-piercing arrows into the disorganized enemy. The slaughter was absolute. The Jin army was decimated, and the way to the capital of Zhongdu was open. The bones of the dead at Badgermouth were said to be visible for decades, creating a white carpet across the mountain pass. The Mongols ravaged the countryside, but the city of Zhongdu, modern-day Beijing, was a fortress with walls 40 feet high and extending for miles. Lacking the machinery to smash the walls, Genghis Khan decided to starve them out. The siege lasted for months. Inside the city, the conditions became horrific as food supplies ran out and disease spread. It is recorded that the inhabitants were forced to resort to cannibalism to survive. Finally, in the summer of 1215, the city surrendered. The Mongols entered, and the looting began. The wealth of generations of emperors was carried back to the steppe on caravans that stretched for miles. Silk, gold, silver, and thousands of captives were taken. The city burned for a month. This victory signaled to the world that the Mongols were not just raiders looking for a quick payout, but conquerors who could topple the greatest empires on earth. Yet, Genghis Khan did not intend to rule China as a sedentary emperor. He took the wealth and returned to the freshness of the grasslands. He left behind generals to govern the conquered territories while he turned his attention westward. He was interested in trade, specifically in the Muslim lands of Central Asia, which produced fine steel, textiles, and glass. He sent a caravan of nearly 500 men to the Khwarezmian Empire, a vast Islamic state that covered modern-day Iran, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. The ruler of this empire was Sultan Muhammad II, a man who saw himself as a second Alexander the Great. When the Mongol caravan arrived at the border city of Otrar, the governor, Inalchuk, filled with greed and suspicion, accused them of being spies. With the Sultan's permission, he executed the merchants and seized their goods. It was a violation of the ancient laws of hospitality and diplomatic immunity. When the news reached Genghis Khan, he was possessed by a cold rage. He went back to the sacred mountain to pray once more. He did not rush. He spent 2 years preparing for the campaign, gathering intelligence from spies and merchants about the roads, the water sources, and the political divisions within the Khwarezmian Empire. He left his general Mukhali in charge of the war in China and marched west with the bulk of his army, dragging with them the siege engineers they had captured from the Jin. This was to be a war of punishment. The Mongol army moved in a massive arc, crossing mountains that were thought to be impassable in the winter. They arrived in the enemy lands not as a single mass, but in 4 separate columns, confusing the Sultan and preventing him from gathering his full strength. The Sultan, afraid of the Mongol prowess in the open field, made the fatal mistake of dividing his army into garrisons inside the cities, allowing the Mongols to isolate and destroy them one by one. The city of Otrar, where the caravan had been murdered, was the first to face the Khan's wrath. The siege lasted 5 months. When the citadel finally fell, the governor Inalchuk was captured alive. Legend holds that Genghis Khan ordered molten silver to be poured into his eyes and ears, a grim punishment for his greed. The Mongols then moved to the wealthy city of Bukhara. Genghis Khan rode his horse into the great mosque, ascended the pulpit, and addressed the trembling citizens. He told them that he was the flail of God, and that if they had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like him upon them. The city was looted and burned, and the artisans were sent back to Mongolia. Next was Samarkand, the jewel of the empire, which fell in a matter of days. The Sultan fled for his life, chased by 2 of Genghis Khan's greatest generals, Jebe and Subutai. They pursued him relentlessly across his own empire, giving him no rest, until he died exhausted and alone on a small island in the Caspian Sea. While the Khan destroyed the heart of the Khwarezmian Empire, he sent his sons Jochi, Chagatai, and Ogadai to besiege the city of Urgench. This siege revealed the cracks in the Mongol unity. Jochi and Chagatai quarreled constantly over the command and the strategy. Jochi wished to preserve the city as it was part of his promised inheritance, while Chagatai wanted to destroy it. The delay angered Genghis Khan, who eventually gave command to his 3rd son, Ogadai. the Mongols finally broke the dams above the city, flooding the streets and drowning the defenders. It was one of the bloodiest episodes of the war. Following this, the Mongols continued their sweep, reaching as far as the Indus River, where they defeated the Sultan's son, Jalal al-Din, in a dramatic battle. The prince rode his horse off a cliff into the river to escape, a feat of bravery that even Genghis Khan admired, forbidding his archers to shoot him. The army then began the long journey home, but the reconnaissance force led by Jebe and Subutai continued a legendary raid around the Caspian Sea. They defeated the Georgian Knights, crossed the Caucasus Mountains in winter, and faced a coalition of Russian princes and Kipchuks at the Battle of the Kaka River in 1223. The Russian armies were crushed. The Mongols celebrated their victory by laying wooden planks over the living bodies of the captured Russian princes and feasting on top of them, slowly crushing them to death as they ate and drank. This expedition was merely a scouting mission, gathering information for a future invasion that would happen under Genghis Khan's successors. But it proved that the Mongol reach knew no bounds. Throughout these years of endless war, Genghis Khan remained focused on the succession. He knew his death would eventually come. He gathered his sons and told them the parable of the arrows. He gave each son an arrow and asked them to break it, which they did easily. He then tied a bundle of arrows together and asked them to break the bundle. None of them could. He told them that if they remained separate, they would be broken like the single arrow, but if they stood together, they would be invincible. He chose Ogedei as his successor, a compromise candidate who was known for his generosity and ability to mediate between his brothers. Jochi, the eldest, whose parentage was always questioned because of his mother's kidnapping by the Merkids, accepted this decision, though the tension remained until his premature death shortly before the Khan zone. With the matter of succession settled among his sons, Genghis Khan turned his eyes toward home. The army began the long march back to Mongolia in 1225. They returned not as the desperate outcasts who had left years before, but as the masters of the world, their horses laden with gold, silver, silk, and the knowledge of distant lands. Yet for the great Khan there was no rest. A piece of unfinished business gnawed at him. During the war against the Khwarezmian Empire, he had called upon his vassals, the Western Shah or Tungits, to send troops to aid him. The Tangut ruler had refused, boldly stating that if Genghis Khan was not strong enough to fight his own battles, he had no business being the Khan. This insult had festered in Genghis Khan's mind throughout the Western campaigns. To a Mongol, loyalty was everything, and betrayal was the one sin that could not be forgiven. Despite his advancing age, which was now over 60, a time when most nomads would retire to their gers to tell stories to their grandchildren, Genghis Khan prepared for war once more. He spent a year resting his army and fattening his horses on the rich grass of the steppe. In the winter of 1226, he rode south across the frozen Gobi Desert to punish the Western Xia. It was to be his final campaign. The Tanguts had a formidable army and well-fortified cities, but they were facing a force that had learned the art of siege warfare from the engineers of China and Persia. The Mongols smashed through the border defenses, capturing city after city with ruthless efficiency. However, during a winter hunt in the early stages of the invasion, disaster struck, The Khan was riding a horse that was startled by a wild ass. He was thrown to the frozen ground, sustaining severe internal injuries. His generals panicked and urged him to halt the campaign and return to Mongolia to heal. They argued that the Tanguts were a sedentary people with walled cities and would not run away so they could be destroyed later. But Genghis Khan refused. He believed that retreating would show weakness. He declared that if he died, he would die conquering. He masked his pain and ordered the army to press on. The campaign continued with brutal intensity. The Mongols met the main Tangut army on the frozen Yellow River. The battle was fierce, fought on the ice, but the Tanguts were utterly destroyed. The Khan's condition worsened as the months passed. He lay in his tent, wrapped in furs, his body failing, but his mind as sharp as ever. He knew the end was near. He summoned his closest advisors and dictated his final strategy for the capture of the Tangut capital, Yinchuan. He ordered that his death be kept a strict secret. If the enemy knew the great Khan was dead, they might find the courage to fight back. He commanded that the attack continue, and that when the city finally surrendered, the royal family of the Tanguts was to be executed, and the city erased from history as a warning to anyone who would dare betray the Mongols. In August of 1227, in a camp near the Lupan Mountains, Genghis Khan took his last breath. He had risen from a destitute boy eating scraps on the tundra to the ruler of the largest empire the world had ever seen. In accordance with his wishes, his death was hidden. The generals continued the siege as if he were still commanding them. When the Tangut ruler finally surrendered, bringing gifts and golden statues to the Mongol camp, he was executed, just as the Khan had ordered. The Western Shia kingdom was annihilated, its culture and language almost entirely extinguished, a grim testament to the Khan's final act of vengeance. The body of the conqueror was then placed on a wagon for the long journey north to the Mongol heartland. The army that escorted him observed a terrifying ritual. To ensure that the news of his death did not travel ahead of them and spark rebellions, they killed every living thing they encountered on the road. Men, women, children, and animals who crossed the path of the funeral procession were put to the sword. They wanted the world to stand still in the wake of the Khan's passing. They brought him to the banks of the Onan River, to the lands of his childhood. He was buried in a grave with no markings, no tombstone, and no monument. 40 moon-like virgins and 40 splendid horses were sacrificed and buried with him to serve him in the afterlife. As per the legends, 1,000 horsemen rode repeatedly over the area to obscure the location, planting trees and allowing the grass to grow back until the earth looked as if it had never been disturbed. The soldiers who buried him were then killed by another group of soldiers, who were in turn killed by others, ensuring that the secret of his final resting place died with the men who dug the earth. With the death of the father, the burden of the empire fell to the son. Ogedei was proclaimed the second great Khan in 1229. He was a different man than his father, more interested in building and enjoying the fruits of conquest than in the hardships of war. He realized that an empire won on horseback could not be governed from horseback. The Mongols needed a capital. He chose a location in the Orkhon Valley, a place sacred to the nomads, and ordered the construction of Karakoram. It was not a massive city like Beijing or Samarkand, but it became the center of the world. Craftsmen from Paris, weavers from China, and silversmiths from Persia were brought there to build palaces and fountains. The most famous was a great silver tree that dispensed wine, mare's milk, rice wine, and honey mead from the mouths of silver dragons and lions, a symbol of the empire's ability to draw the wealth of the world to a single point. Under Ogedei and his successors, the empire continued to expand, but it also began to transform. The system Genghis Khan had built, the yam, became the nervous system of the ancient world. Riders stationed at posts every 20 or 30 miles could carry a message from the Pacific to the Mediterranean in a matter of weeks. They wore bells so the station masters could hear them coming and have a fresh horse ready. This system allowed merchants to travel safely with a golden tablet, known as a paisa, which acted like a passport, granting them protection and supplies. For the first time in history, the East and the West were directly connected. A man could walk from Venice to Beijing with a gold plate on his head and not be molested, as the saying went. This era became known as the Pax Mongolica, or the Mongol Peace. The exchange of ideas was unprecedented. Chinese gunpowder, paper money, and printing technology flowed west to Europe and the Middle East. Medical knowledge, mathematics, and astronomy flowed east to China. The Mongols, who had no strong religious dogmas of their own, were fascinated by the debates of priests and monks. In Karakoram, the Khans would hold debates where Christians, Muslims, and Buddhists would argue the merits of their faiths, while the Mongols listened and drank, judging the winners not by their theology, but by their logic and rhetoric. However, the unity of the empire could not last forever. The seeds of division that Genghis Khan had feared began to sprout. The empire was divided into 4 great khanates, ruled by the descendants of his 4 sons. In the west, the Golden Horde ruled over Russia. In the Middle East, the Ilkhanate ruled over Persia. In Central Asia, the Chagatai Khanate held sway. And in the east, the Great Khan ruled over Mongolia and China, eventually establishing the Yuan dynasty under Genghis's grandson, Kublai Khan. While they all theoretically owed allegiance to the Great Khan in the east, in reality they began to drift apart, eventually fighting wars against each other. Yet the legacy of Genghis Khan was already cemented. He had destroyed the old world order and built a new one. He was a man of contradictions. He was a ruthless killer who wiped out entire cities, yet he was a meritocratic leader who promoted the poor and protected religious freedom. He was an illiterate nomad who understood the value of writing and law. He conquered more land than Alexander the Great, Napoleon, and Hitler combined, yet he lived simply, wearing the same furs and eating the same food as his humblest soldiers. He had united the scattered tribes of the steppe and turned them into a force that shook the foundations of civilization. In the centuries that followed, his bloodline became the most prestigious pedigree in Asia. Kings and emperors from India to Turkey claimed descent from him to legitimize their rule. The world he left behind was smaller, more connected, and forever changed. The Silk Road he revived brought the Black Death to Europe, which decimated the population, but also paved the way for the Renaissance. The gunpowder his armies used destroyed the castles of the feudal lords, ending the Middle Ages. His story is not just the story of a man, but the story of a force of nature that swept across the earth, tearing down the old to make way for the new. And somewhere in the vast, silent wilderness of the Khenti Mountains, the Great Khan sleeps, undisturbed by the passage of time, while the world he forged continues to turn. The story of the Great Khan did not truly end with his burial in the secret earth of the Khenti Mountains, for the machine of conquest he built was too powerful to simply stop. The momentum he had generated continued to propel the Mongol armies forward, and the years following his death saw the empire reach its absolute zenith in terms of sheer terrifying violence and geographical reach. Ogedei Khan, the 3rd son whom Genghis had chosen for his temperament, proved to be a capable administrator who understood that to hold the world, he needed to build a bureaucracy that could function without him. He established a permanent capital at Karakoram, but while the city was being built, the generals were restless. The Mongol economy was based on plunder and tribute, and to keep the peace among the diverse tribes, new wealth had to flow into the center constantly. The gaze of the empire turned toward the west, to the lands of the Rus and beyond, into the heart of Europe. This campaign would be led by Batu, the grandson of Genghis, but the true mastermind was Subutai. Subutai was the greatest military genius the Mongols ever produced, an old dog of war who had ridden beside Genghis Khan in the earliest days. He was now an old man, overweight, and often riding in a carriage rather than on a horse, but his mind was as sharp as a blade. He devised a plan to invade Europe that was breathtaking in its ambition and coordination. In 1236, the Mongol army, known to the west as the Golden Horde, swept across the Volga River. The Russian principalities, divided by their own petty squabbles, fell one by one. The city of Ryazan was the first to refuse surrender. The Mongols built a stockade around the entire city to prevent escape, and bombarded it with catapults for 5 days before storming the walls. The destruction was total. Next came Vladimir, and then Kiev, the mother of Russian cities. When the Mongol envoys arrived in Kiev to demand submission, the inhabitants killed them and threw their bodies from the walls. In retaliation, the Mongols leveled the cities so thoroughly that travelers passing by years later found only skulls scattered in the grass where a great metropolis had once stood. With Russia subdued, Subutai looked further west to Hungary and Poland. The European powers were unprepared for what was coming. They viewed the Mongols as a disorganized rabble of savages, failing to understand that they were facing the most disciplined army in the world. In 1241, Subutai split his forces. He sent a smaller army to Poland to distract the northern Europeans, while the main army marched into Hungary. The northern force met the Polish Knights and the Teutonic Order at the Battle of Legnica. The European knights, encased in heavy iron armor, charged the light Mongol cavalry. The Mongols simply retreated, drawing the knights into an ambush, where they were surrounded and choked by smoke bombs before being cut down by arrows. The Grand Master of the Teutonic Knights and the Duke of Silesia were both killed. To count the dead, the Mongols cut an ear off each corpse, filling 9 large sacks. Meanwhile, the main army under Batu and Subutai faced the King of Hungary at the Battle of Mohi. The Hungarians had a strong position across a bridge on the Sajo River. In the dead of night, Subutai led a detachment of men through deep marshes to cross the river downstream, flanking the Hungarians at dawn. When the Mongols attacked, they used Chinese firecrackers and smoke to confuse the enemy. The Hungarian camp was surrounded, but the Mongols deliberately left a small gap in their lines, a trap known as the Golden Bridge. The terrified Hungarian soldiers, seeing an escape route, broke ranks and fled through the gap. As they ran, they lost their formation and were hunted down easily by the Mongol horsemen. It was a massacre that left the Kingdom of Hungary in ruins. By the winter of 1241, the Mongol scouts were sighting the outskirts of Vienna. The Holy Roman Empire and the rest of Western Europe trembled in terror. There was no army left that could stop them. It seemed that nothing could prevent the Mongols from reaching the Atlantic Ocean. But then, a single rider arrived from the east, carrying a message that changed history. Genghis Khan had died in Karakoram. According to the law of Genghis Khan, all princes and generals had to return to the homeland to elect a new great Khan. The invasion of Europe was called off instantly. The armies turned around and marched back to the steppe, never to return. Europe had been saved not by its armies or its prayers, but by the death of a man thousands of miles away. This event marked a turning point as the unity of the empire began to fracture under the weight of succession politics. For the next 10 years, the empire was held together by powerful women. With the princes fighting for power, it was the queens, or khatuns, who ruled. Torajin Khatun, the wife of Ogedekai, ruled as regent for 5 years. She was a shrewd politician who maneuvered to have her son Gayuk elected as the next Khan. She fired her husband's ministers and replaced them with her own loyalists, playing the princes against each other to secure her son's throne.
When Gayuk was finally elected, his reign was short and troubled, lasting only 2 years before he died, possibly from poisoning or the effects of alcoholism, a vice that plagued many of Genghis Khan's descendants. The throne then passed to the house of Tolui, who sought to return to the ways of his grandfather. He purged his rivals in a bloody coup, and then set his sights on the 2 remaining powers that defied Mongol rule, which were the Song dynasty in southern China and the Islamic Caliphate in the Middle East. He sent his brother Hulagu to the Middle East with a massive army. Hulagu's first target was the Order of Assassins, a secretive sect based in mountain fortresses in Persia. For nearly 2 centuries, the assassins had terrorized the region, killing kings and viziers who opposed them. Their castles were thought to be impregnable, perched on high cliffs. But the Mongols brought their siege engineers. They climbed the mountains and bombarded the castles, until the leader of the assassins surrendered. He was sent to Mongolia, where he was trampled to death by horses, and his order was exterminated. Hulagu then turned toward Baghdad, the center of the Islamic world, a city of scholars, poets, and immense wealth. The Caliph of Baghdad, trusting in his city's defenses and believing that the entire Muslim world would rise to defend him, refused to submit.
It was a fatal miscalculation. The Mongols arrived in 1258 and encircled the city. They built a palisade around it and began the bombardment. When the city fell, the destruction was apocalyptic. The House of Wisdom, the greatest library in the world, was destroyed. It is said that the Tigris River ran black with the ink of books and red with the blood of scientists and philosophers. The Caliph was captured and, according to legend, locked in a tower with his gold but no food, to starve among his treasures, or wrapped in a carpet and trampled by horses so that royal blood would not touch the ground. The golden age of Islam was dealt a blow from which it would take centuries to recover. While Hulagu was destroying Baghdad, Mongol Khan was leading the campaign against the Song dynasty in China. The Song were masters of gunpowder and possessed a navy, making them a difficult enemy. The war was a slow grind of sieges and naval battles. During a siege in the humid south, Mongol Khan fell ill, likely with dysentery or cholera. His death in 1259 once again triggered a succession crisis, saving the Islamic world from further invasion, just as Ogedei's death had saved Europe. Hulagu, who was poised to march into Egypt and North Africa, had to withdraw the bulk of his army to attend the selection of the new Khan. This time the succession did not go smoothly. 2 brothers, Kublai and Arik Boke, both declared themselves Great Khan. Kublai controlled the wealth of China, while Arik Boke controlled the Mongol homeland and the traditionalists.
They fought a civil war that lasted 4 years.
It was a war of the new ways against the old. Kublai represented a Mongol empire that had adapted to civilization, while Arik-Boke represented the nomadic traditions of the steppe. In the end, Kublai's resources and strategic control of food supplies gave him the victory. Kublai Khan became the ruler of a vast domain, but the unity of the empire was shattered forever. The Western Khanates recognized him only in name, operating as independent empires. Kublai turned his full attention to conquering the rest of China. He understood that he could not rule the Chinese on horseback. He adopted Chinese customs, moved his capital to Beijing, which he named Dadu, or Great Capital, and declared the Yuan dynasty. He finished what his grandfather Genghis had started. In 1279, at the naval battle of Yamen, the last Song emperor, a young boy, was defeated. A loyal minister, realizing all was lost, took the boy emperor in his arms and jumped into the sea, ending the Song dynasty. For the first time in history, all of China was united under foreign rule. Kublai Khan ruled as a Chinese emperor, patronizing the arts and sciences. He built the Grand Canal, introduced paper currency that was used throughout the realm, and welcomed travelers from afar, including the Venetian merchant Marco Polo. Polo's writings would later introduce Europe to the wonders of the East, describing a land of burning black stones, which was coal, and vast cities that made Venice look like a village.
Yet, despite the grandeur, the Mongols remained a distinct ruling class. They enforced a hierarchy where Mongols were at the top, followed by other foreigners, then Northern Chinese, and finally the Southern Chinese at the bottom. They forbade the Chinese from carrying weapons and confiscated their horses. This racial segregation created deep resentment that would eventually lead to their downfall. The final years of the Mongol Empire were marked by a slow decline. The warrior spirit that had been forged in the harsh winters of the steppe began to fade in the comfort of the palaces. The later Khans lost touch with the people, spending their time in debauchery and neglecting the administration. Floods, famines, and plagues weakened the population. The Black Death, which had traveled along the very trade routes the Mongols had opened, devastated the empire, killing millions and destabilizing the economy. In 1368, a peasant rebellion led by a monk named Su Yuanzhang rose up against the Yuan dynasty. The Mongols, weakened by infighting and soft living, were pushed out of China and forced to retreat back to the Mongolian steppe. The Ming dynasty was established, and the Great Wall was reinforced to ensure the nomads would never return. The empire of Genghis Khan had risen like a storm and receded, but it had irrevocably changed the shape of the world. It had drawn the map of the modern world, creating nations like Russia and China. It had mixed the genes of Asia and Europe. It had proven that a determined will, organized with ruthless efficiency, could overcome any obstacle.
The story of the Mongols is a testament to human capacity for both greatness and cruelty. Even today, in the quiet valleys of Mongolia, the spirit of the Great Khan is felt in the wind that blows across the grass, a reminder of the time when the hoofbeats of his horses were the heartbeat of the world. Though the Yuan dynasty had fallen and the Mongols had retreated back to the land of their ancestors, the story of the Mongols did not vanish into history. They returned to the steppe, to the life of the felt tent and the horse, resuming the nomadic existence that had sustained them for millennia before Genghis Khan had ever been born. This period became known as the Northern Yuan. The great city of Karakoram, once the capital of the world where silver fountains flowed with wine, was eventually sacked and burned by the vengeful Ming armies. The stones of the palace were left to be swallowed by the grass, and the people dispersed once again into the vastness of the plains. Yet the blood of the golden lineage, the direct descendants of Genghis Khan, continued to hold a sacred power. For centuries, Only a man who could trace his ancestry back to the Great Khan could claim the title of Khan. This legitimacy was so powerful that even as the empire fractured, powerful warlords in Central Asia, like the fearsome Tamerlane, dared not call themselves Khan because they lacked the royal blood. Instead, they ruled as emirs and married into the Genghisid family to borrow the prestige of the conqueror.
The legacy of the Mongols continued to ripple outward in unexpected ways. In India, a descendant of Genghis Khan named Outcast would establish the Mughal Empire, a dynasty that would rule the subcontinent for centuries and build wonders like the Taj Mahal, blending Persian culture with the martial heritage of the steppe. In the West, the Golden Horde continued to rule over the Russian principalities for nearly 2 more centuries. It was the longest-lasting of the Mongol Khanates. They shaped the Russian state, influencing its military organization, its postal system, and its centralized government. When the Russian czars finally threw off the Tatar yoke, they adopted the title of Tsar, a variation of Caesar, but their power structure owed much to the model left behind by the Khans. The influence of the Mongols was woven so deeply into the fabric of Eurasia that it became invisible, part of the daily life of nations from the Pacific to the Black Sea. As the centuries rolled on, the figure of Genghis Khan transformed from a man into a myth. In the West, he was often remembered as a symbol of ruthless destruction, a barbarian at the gate. But in his homeland, he remained the father of the nation, a spiritual figure who had given the Mongols their identity. He was venerated not just as a king, but as a deity in local folk religion. Shrines were maintained where his spirit was believed to reside, housing relics like his saddle and his bow. During the 20th century, when Mongolia fell under the influence of the Soviet Union, the worship of Genghis Khan was forbidden. The Soviets feared that his memory would stir up nationalism. They closed the shrines and erased his name from school books, trying to bury his legacy, just as his body had been buried in the secret earth. But the memory of the wolf cannot be tamed. When Mongolia regained its democracy in the early 1990s, Genghis Khan returned. His image appeared on the currency, on the vodka, and on the hillside monuments. The airport was named after him. He was reclaimed not as a conqueror, but as a lawgiver, a unifier, and a man of unyielding will. The modern world began to reevaluate him, recognizing his contributions to trade, religious tolerance, and diplomatic immunity. He was declared by some historians as the man of the millennium, the individual who had done more to connect the human race than any other. Today, the landscape that birthed him remains largely unchanged. The Anand River still flows cold and clear through the Khenti Mountains. The grass of the steppe still waves in the endless wind, turning from green to gold with the passing of the seasons. The herders still tend to their horses and sheep, living in round white gers, drinking salted milk tea, and telling the secret history of their ancestors by the firelight. And somewhere in those forbidden mountains, in a place known as the Ik Korig, or the Great Taboo, the grave of Genghis Khan lies undisturbed. Despite modern technology, satellite imagery, and the curiosity of the world, his final resting place has never been found. It is protected by the sheer ruggedness of the land and the fierce devotion of his people, who believe that disturbing his sleep would bring disaster. The trees that were planted over his tomb have grown into a thick, impenetrable forest, and the river that was diverted flows silently over the stones. He sleeps as he wished, returned to the elements, cradled by the earth that he once conquered. The empire of stone and wood has crumbled, but the empire of the sky and the grass remains eternal, watching over the slumber of the universal ruler until the end of time.